Welcome to the People Prescription. Today we've got Karen Mills with us. We're talking about addiction in the workplace, reasonable adjustments, and also leadership skills as well. Karen comes with a wealth of experience in the care sector, over 2 decades. She's a lifelong learner, exactly like myself. And great to have you with us today, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to this conversation.
So you started in care, Karen, during your final year at BSc, I believe. And what did you see in those first months that made you want to stay in care for 2 decades?
You're right. Yeah, I did start my final year of my bachelor's. I often say in care, it's either intentional or you fall into it. And I definitely fell into it. It wasn't at first my chosen career path. My first couple of months, it was really difficult, as a lot of people would say, being that close and supporting people with personal care and quite intimate things. It's really difficult, particularly at the age of 20. It was quite difficult. But what I soon noticed in care is this wonderful level of camaraderie in the team. Good days, bad days, picking each other up, thinking of each other if something's happening, working around appointments, and just this lovely sense of camaraderie. So that's definitely what kept me in it and still keeps me in it to this day.
Absolutely. And from more recently then, so I understand around the COVID time that pushed you back into study. What specifically did that time for you expose that your existing knowledge couldn't answer? So you went into, I believe, you did the masters just after COVID and you're now studying a PhD. But what would you say, based on where you were at that time and where you are now, that some of those things that were unanswered, you've now got some real clear, steady insights around those areas?
Yeah, I think my master's and my PhD are quite different, which I can go into a little bit more. So I
Yeah.
decided to do my master's in business psychology. I thought it was a wonderful idea to do that during COVID while working in care. But what I identified is care has always been underfunded,
Hmm.
underthought, not as an essential service. And I suppose leaning towards my master's in business psychology was I wanted to get a better understanding of care as a business. A lot of care companies don't market themselves as a business, and it is.
Right.
And for me, I wanted to understand that financial impact better. So up until that point, I'd run services and had budgets handed to me. And I was at the point where, for my own personal development, I need to understand how we work out them budgets, how we spend them
Hmm.
budgets, what we have to think of behind the scenes, payroll, overheads, margins, all them sort of things. I wanted to better understand it so I could develop the service and be more involved. So that was the reason for my master's. I did it part time while working, and it was a wonderful experience. And the people that I met on the masters were all from different sectors, all doing different things. So yeah, it was a really wonderful experience.
I can relate to that too. I think a lot of the time, not only have you got the educational aspect of when you do a course, or you've also got the opportunity to really associate with like-minded people. When I did my masters, there's almost a serendipity in the room. You've got a lot of like-minded people that are eager to learn, eager to grow. And with that growth as well, you also grow your network too. So it's a great opportunity for people. And it also gives us really good insight about your experiences and your expertise too. So that's awesome. So what you mentioned there about the PhD.
Yeah, 20 years in adult social care. And it's only been the last sort of 7, 8 years I've been particularly working with addiction, individuals struggling with addiction. And what I soon came to notice was people with a dual diagnosis. And when I say dual diagnosis, it's a diagnosis of mental health and an
Right.
addiction. The services weren't often fit for purpose. So what would happen is these individuals would have one referral to a mental health service and one referral to an addiction service. These two services wouldn't necessarily talk to each other. And then we had a lot of our service users falling through the gaps because they weren't
Mhm.
necessarily talking to each other, and a lot of discord between expectations as well. So that's what kind of led me towards my PhD, with a particular focus on the service specifics and whether they're actually fit for purpose for people with this dual diagnosis.
I'm with you. I'm with you. And certainly with employment law and people operations, laws are constantly changing. Best practices are always being reviewed. And I find that there's a lot of similarity really with the care industry. There's a lot of regulation. There's a lot of things to keep on top of. So having that opportunity to learn at that level, it really does sharpen the axe, as they say, and it makes sure that, you're in line and your knowledge is current of the existing climate at the moment, certainly within HR circles, employment law, and everything from flexible working to reasonable adjustments and protection for workers around equality protection. There's a huge shake-up at the moment in the UK. There's the Employment Rights Act 2025, which is probably the biggest shake-up in a generation as far as governance is concerned for businesses. And I'm finding at the moment that it's difficult. I mean, that's my bread and butter. That's what we do with the HR doctor, and it's incredibly difficult to keep on top of those changes. And I just genuinely feel for businesses who really, with the HR doctor, that's our solid focus. That's how we do what we do and deliver our services through governance and compliance, performance review support. And it's a difficult thing for us to keep on top of, which we do successfully. It's incredibly difficult for business leaders to do that when they're spinning so many other plates as well. So those kind of things that you've shared there, massively important for business leaders who are very much on that journey too, of self-awareness, of understanding, of building the knowledge around what their services need. And yeah, it's constantly changing, isn't it? Would you find that's the case too in terms of best practices? Are they under review a great deal within your area, within the care sector?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Funnily enough, I had a conversation with someone this morning and I spoke about my 20-year journey. And I can remember when I first got into care, and it was acceptable to drag lift people up the bed. Now, we wouldn't dream of
Right,
that now. We have all
right,
sorts of amazing equipment and better tools to do it and better ways to do it as well. So even as simple as moving and handling, that has changed so much in 20 years and it will continue to change. I can remember the first hoist where you had to physically pump the person up. It was a manual hoist and now it's a touch of a
right.
button. So there's an element there as well of technical advancement that's helping us in our sector. But like you mentioned there about the Employment Rights Act, the Mental Capacity Act has been reviewed and that
Right.
has not been reviewed in many years. So even that in itself has brought around a change in policies, procedures, liabilities. Our insurance documents have changed because of that. So there's not just the operational aspect, it's also the governance behind the scenes that gets changed a lot.
I'm with you. I'm with you. And yeah, I think genuinely there's a lot of business leaders out there that can relate to that. I can remember many moons ago, there changes around retirement rules and auto enrollment. And there's so much governance now that goes on for employers that they're perhaps not in a position to keep on top of. And it's super important to listen to these kind of podcasts or learning material to keep on top of some of the things that are changing, different viewpoints. So yeah, we can relate to that 100%. If you'd have asked me 8 or 9 years ago, could you let somebody go if they presented certain, for example, like alcoholism, or there's been a lot of discussion around things like obesity in the workplace and the protections that are afforded now to employees. And again, quite rightly, it's important that people are looked after. I do genuinely think that if you look after your team, they're looking after you too. There are always exceptions to that. Don't get me wrong, Karen. There'll be the odd person that does abuse that trust. But at the same time, we spend a hell of a lot of time at work, don't we? So why not create a place where people can thrive and get reward from the work that they do, not least, not only the monetary side, but also the psychology, the safety that comes with that, the meaning that comes from the work that they do. And that's something I find certainly in the care industry, where there's a lot of similarity really with the people operations, because ultimately most people I speak to in HR, they do it because they like people. They enjoy creating space for people where they can do the best work. So there's a lot of similarities there I find with the care industry. Coming on to that then, so knowing your team and I know when we've spoke before, we've shared what I consider to be really the heartbeat of people ops as well as care. Perhaps it's really about creating space for people to do great work. And one of the key things when I've spoken to business leaders is that it's about getting to know the team, getting to understand the team. And before we get into, I know you've got a case study that's, I think, going to be a fantastic way to illustrate this. But what would you say getting to know somebody on your team really means, and beyond knowing the name and the role, before we get into the case study, do you have like a working definition that you tend to go to when you're thinking about, okay, how do we approach this initially?
Yeah, I think for me, knowing my team is knowing them all, knowing the whole of them, inside and outside of work, what motivates them, what demotivates them, what makes them feel good, what makes them feel stressed. It's knowing them indicators as well. And I think the biggest way to do that is time investment in your team. Now, I know that's really difficult, particularly in my role. We're very front facing, we're very busy, there's a lot going on day to day, but what's also important is the impact that has on the relationship with your staff. If they notice that you are taking the time to spend time with them, for me, it could be going to visit one of our service users. I'll come with you. And you do that 30-minute car ride together and you go and see the service user and that 30-minute car drive back. And suddenly you've spent 2 hours with a staff member and an hour of that is talking about all sorts there and all sorts back. And I think time investment is one of the most important ways to do it, but also the most difficult.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the few things that we have that isn't an infinite resource, is it? We've got to prioritize. We've got to be able to put urgent matters forward, important matters forward, and establish, that prioritization. But I do genuinely think for a leader, this is a top priority because, as you shared there, this has an impact on services that are being provided, and also ultimately making sure that your people, the well-being of your people and your team, are being looked after too. So walk me through. So the case study that we discussed prior to the podcast today, you had a team member who, before a bereavement, he was particularly praised by his peers. Walk me through what happened.
This is a case study from quite a few years ago, and it's the case study that piqued my interest in addiction in the workplace, really. So he was always very diligent. Like you said, he was liked by his peers, always on time, and he always went above and beyond in his role. He was somebody that a lot of people looked up to. He went off work due to a bereavement in the family, and he was supported through that. When he returned, there were some signs and symptoms which were pushed to being due to mourning, low mood, a little bit different to usual, not as motivated as he was. Over time, he had a couple of complaints, which is very unusual for this particular person. We noticed that he'd lost weight, he'd stopped going out. So every month we used to do a staff outing where go for a few drinks, go for a meal, go bowling, all them sort of things. And he slowly stopped attending these things, which was really difficult. But what happened, he had quite a large complaint come through. And from then it did lead to a disciplinary. And
Right.
in that disciplinary, he openly admitted that he had been struggling with an alcohol addiction. From there, you look back, don't you, in the scenario and go, why did I not notice? Why didn't we pick up signs and symptoms? But now that I've been through that situation, I've looked back and gone, we noticed the weight loss. We noticed he wasn't dressing as well as he would. He wasn't performing like he was. But we almost dismissed it for mourning. Instead of really asking the questions, are you
Mm-hmm.
okay? We've noticed this. Just checking in that you're all right. So yeah, it was something that really, it stayed with me all these years.
And you've mentioned there a couple of specific points. So looking back now, what would you say would be the first real signal that you saw based on, so there was different ones that you shared there. Not only the first sign that you noticed at the time, but the first one that was really there.
The quietness. He
Right.
was always such a jolly and engaging in everything. And I would say the quietness and the lack of banter. So we always had a really good banter within the team.
Right.
So that was definitely the first signs.
Okay. That's interesting. I mean, again, we hear a lot in people ops circles around banter, and there's that piece around, especially like when somebody shares banter, a lot of the time from a legislative perspective, when we look at things like the Equality Act and harassment and that kind of thing, it's not necessarily the intention that goes behind the banter. It's how it's received. And I know in this particular case, we're talking about somebody perhaps who was very engaged, clearly somebody who was well thought of, respected within the workforce, and there was a respect there from his peers. And ultimately, it has led to what would be a disciplinary situation. I find it really helpful when we're going through these things to really strip back and figure out, okay, what could have been done differently to have avoided that situation in the first place? Or a lot of the times it could even be a simple assumption that people are unpredictable. One person can be incredibly jolly one day, and because of circumstances outside of the employer's control, they may be a completely different person. So it's about being able to build systems, in my view, within a workforce which allow you to very quickly surface these things and ultimately support the employee to solve them. And for those that are listening to the podcast that are very much focused on pounds and pence and financial accountability within an organization, a lot of what we're sharing today in today's podcast are very simple things that can be used to avoid what would be incredibly costly situations for organizations, not only from a perspective of governance, but also it makes sense to have a conversation with team members early. So they take, again, the process of having that conversation can avoid future absences, future concerns, and being able to surface and challenge kindly in a kind and direct approach the challenges that person's facing can make a lot of sense financially too. People might take a lot less time off if they're unwell. You might avoid departures. Recruitment's incredibly expensive for organizations. There's been some data I've been reviewing recently that suggests it could cost between 6 to 9 months pay per role if that's done incorrectly. So if somebody was to leave, that's a huge investment that you're making in people, where if they left because of some of the things we're touching on today, a lack of communication definitely is something we see a lot in people ops across many organizations. And it's not through intent, I would say. It's more to do with, as you were touching on, business leaders don't always have the time to connect and communicate. So then, in my view, it's about, we've got to look at what you're prioritizing, because this, in my view, is one of the most important things about a business. Businesses are relational. It's about making sure you've got a good relationship with the people who are ultimately delivering on your services. And yeah, I find that, again, speaking to those points that you mentioned there are sometimes signals that people can connect with very early to avoid these situations happening. And I find, certainly with people ops, a lot of people ops is 90% prevention and 10% reaction. So it's focusing on what can we do to prevent challenges rather than reactively dealing with people issues when they pop up. So what would you say from the team's perspective? Would you say, from what you were sharing, it seems like there was an assumption that the gentleman was mourning. What do you think made that assumption feel reasonable in the moment for this situation for the other team members?
I think there was an assumption that addiction doesn't happen in the workplace. It wasn't even on anyone's radar for it to even be a possibility. Now, I always work to the theory now that if we hear about addiction in a formal disciplinary, we've identified it too late. So, what can we do to prevent that from happening? And
Right.
from the scenario, what I will say is I saw the most amazing response from the manager. As soon as that staff member had said that, the disciplinary in that moment stopped. This is something that we need to find out more about and support you with before this disciplinary moves forward. You've told us something that is impacting on your physical and mental health. Yes, you should have told us earlier, but actually, did we create a psychologically safe space for them to do? There is a massive
Right.
stigma with addiction. It's fearful. A lot of people have said they won't mention it because of fear of retribution. So at that point, that gentleman must have felt there was no other option but to inform us. So I saw the most amazing reaction. Let's support you with advice, guidance, organizations. Let's pull out the company policy and procedure on what we can do. And at that time, I'm talking 12, 13 years ago, the company didn't have a
Right.
policy on addiction in the workplace. So I saw this massive movement from this one scenario. And I think for me, it was a real moment of, there's a gap. There's a gap here. And what can we do to help them? So yeah, it was a big learning curve, not just for us, but for the organization as well at the time.
100%. I find that when we speak to employers about, there's a case, particularly, this was from many years ago, where at the time I was a HR advisor, probably 14 years ago. And what struck me was the response. And I understand this response, but I wouldn't necessarily say I agree with it. And a lot of what you've shared here around the addiction, the employer at the time, we were looking at the policies, the procedures you were touching on there, which is the starting point. I wouldn't say it's the end point by any means, but it sets the
Mm.
intention. And we were chatting with this employer about the policies around things like domestic abuse in the workplace. And ultimately, at that time, when we flagged it with the employee, they became incredibly frustrated. And the line was, how is this my responsibility that we've got to be able to put a policy in place to prevent domestic abuse in the workplace? And I understand that perspective, but I also understand that as an employee, you've put yourself in a position of responsibility, which, when we look at, okay, what's the rational argument behind it from a finance perspective, if we just put that hat on for a moment, if you're looking after your team and you're providing them with a safe, secure space to have those kind of conversations, whether it be addiction led, domestic abuse, drug use in the workplace, whatever it might be, there's an opportunity, I'd say a responsibility on that employer to have certain mechanisms in place to be able to support that person and hopefully in these circumstances avoid those situations popping up or being experienced by the employee. But there's a real business case for that as well too, in my view. There's a business case from the perspective of if you're doing that, I'm not just only talking about governance here, where now, as we touched on it earlier, some of these things are mandatory that businesses have to do. From a regulatory perspective, there has to be certain measures in place to avoid discrimination in the workplace, as an example. But these kind of things, there is that, I believe, a misconception out there amongst employers where they genuinely believe that this isn't my responsibility. And I think ultimately there is a responsibility there because you've got a really fantastic team working with you, delivering on the promises that you're making to your customers, whether that's in care or in more commercial sectors. And with that responsibility, there is a real benefit of either upskilling team members in how to manage these things effectively or having tricky conversations with people, which is always one that I know a lot of business leaders shy away from because, and I understand it, they're incredibly busy, focused on how they can ultimately make the business survive and thrive. But I'd say that from what I've seen over the last couple of decades, looking after your people and touching on some of the points we've already mentioned here, feeds into that narrative as well. It feeds into if we look after our people, then the profits thrive as well, whether that be profits for a purpose if you're working in the charity sector or profits for a private business or care company. There are real financial reasons behind this too, to ultimately explore today. And from what you shared, it seems like you're living by that line now that, if you hear about an addiction in a disciplinary, it's just way too far down the line. You've identified it much too late. What would you say that changes about how you run meetings now, on a Monday morning, for example? Like what's happening in practice?
I think the team that I've got currently, I've worked with them for a long period of time and I've come to know them. I know their personal circumstances. This has just happened naturally over conversations, getting to know each other. And likewise, I share as well. I'm quite open in the fact I have two children, doing my PhD, things that are happening in my personal life, because I think sharing both ways helps build that relationship, doesn't it, with your staff? And I think it's a difficult one if you don't know the boundary of what to share. I'm still their manager. I've still got a service to run and
Mm-hmm.
they know I've got to make difficult decisions that they're not always going to be happy with. But what I'd like to think is that they respect my decisions and they know I'm not doing or making any decisions for anyone else's benefit, but for the service. I think that in
Yes.
itself helps me to identify things in my team. So in my team, I do something called a mental health check-in.
Right.
And once a week, I will reach out to all of my staff, whether it's text, email, phone call, and it'll just say mental health check-in. And I get a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If it's a thumbs up, perfect, lovely. If it's a thumbs down, do you want me to call you? Do you want me to text? Or is it not the right time right now? And they'll tell me their boundary. I'm not ready to talk about it right now, but can you call me after 5 o'clock? I'm supposed to stop work at 5, but Ken never stops at 5. Or today's particularly busy. Can I call you first thing in the morning? Yeah, absolutely. But you've got to build that relationship and then boundaries up to feel that you can do that. I
100%.
even do it with my directors. It goes upwards and it goes downwards. And I will check in with them and go, mental health check in. Is everything okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that indication, it shows that ultimately you care as a leader about the team. and they understand as well the root cause behind, like, why is Karen asking these questions in the first place? And usually when people know the why, they're very quick to come on board with things where there's perhaps a lack of communication around the reasons. And typically for businesses, where the HR doctor helps with this is it could be looking at your mission and values as an organization, making sure they're communicated with transparency. And I'm not only talking about posters on a wall here, we're talking about, like, how do the leaders show up? How do people develop their individuals within the workplace? And that first step towards establishing what the values of the organizations are, like, for example, with the HR doctor, one big value is around accountability. We're accountable for the work that we do, and not least because it has huge ripple effects on organizations. And that's something where, and again, not everybody is particularly warm to the idea of accountability. But at the same time, it can be incredibly empowering to have that once you go through that process of selection, and it gives people a huge amount of autonomy, that they're empowered to do the work in a way that's effective, that is productive and regularly accounted for. We have weekly sit downs with all our team members to make sure that people are comfortable in the work that they're delivering on. If there are challenges, that they surface quickly. And one of the big parts of a lead, when you touched on it there, is that from a mind health perspective, and which again feeds into the addiction narrative as well, one of the key things is having that conversation to surface these things in the first place, these challenges. And a lot of leaders genuinely understand why they don't want to raise that in a discussion, and you don't necessarily need to raise it as such. It's just asking an open-ended question, like, how are you feeling today? How is everything? Like, we do this at the HR Doctor by asking people to rate meetings out of 10. And it's a very simple self-reflection exercise, but it allows us to understand things that perhaps people would be a little bit more reluctant to share. So if somebody's going to rate a meeting out of 10, if they come back with, say, a 7, then the person leading that meeting ultimately goes back and, with curiosity more so than anything, ask the question, how do we get it to an 8 or a 9? And typically, when there's that self-reflection opportunity that's given, people tend to be a lot more warm to the idea because it's depersonalized straight away. We're not talking about them, we're talking about the meeting. It gives them a safe space then to share perhaps something that's on the mind at the moment that's not making that meeting quite an 8, or they might be concerned that they're not delivering on a certain aspect of their role, in which case the leader's role, in my view, is to remove those barriers and those blockers. But in order to remove them, we first need to understand what they are. And that's a big part of leadership. And touching on what you shared there, it seems that that's a big part of what you're doing there by asking those questions. It's about surfacing them so you can understand the blockers. Like, what type of blockers do people share with you when you ask those kind of questions? What kind of things have you noticed any themes or trends around the feedback that's provided?
Quite often, I would say 50-50. 50% is work related, 50% is actually personal related. I can get text to say something's happening in my personal life, somebody's unwell, or it could be this particular service user I'm struggling with because of this, that, and the other, and I just don't know the best next steps. So instead of them feeling a feeling of, with work, going, oh, I don't know what to do next, actually we've opened up the conversation for them to say, I'm not quite sure. And then that's when you say, how can I help? Instead of them coming to ask, that's always my next question. How can I help?
Absolutely.
And I want them to come up with the idea and suggestion. I don't want it to feel like I'm telling them, you need to do this, do that. How can I help? Is it a 5-minute conversation?
Yeah,
Let's
absolutely.
talk it through. You know this person better than I do. It's empowering them.
It's creating that space for them to find the response that, the thread's probably already there. They understand what the next step is. It's teasing that out in a way that, through effective questions, as you shared there, open-ended questions. One of the ways that we certainly build more leadership autonomy within the HR Doctor is by presenting a scenario where we're saying, look, if we weren't in the room now, how would you handle it? Or if we were on holiday, or if we were doing something else, if we were in a meeting and this presented itself, how would you deal with it? And it could be a simple case of going, fantastic, great, that's exactly what I would have done in the first place. But it gives people the confidence then to know that, first and foremost, that they are capable, that gives them the confidence to then take the next step. And yeah, genuinely, that's a really powerful way to build responsibility, accountability, whatever you want to call it, within an organization. And of course, that grows too, because ultimately people learn from what they do. So if they see the leader doing that, then that's then shared with their other wider team or reports colleagues. It's a bit of an osmosis that happens. There's a chain reaction when that kind of level of communication's occurring it takes time. Good things take time. It's not like a magic wand where we can start building accountability up from day one. It starts with that first step on the journey, and that journey is regular meetings, certainly. So just touching on something you mentioned there about on the care side, it seems that from what we've discussed before, that the responsibility and certainly like the resource balance, the thread, it seems like quite a fresh thread that the care sector's focused on at the moment, which would be collaboration over competition. And you said that when we spoke previously, you mentioned that care organisations are no longer competing with each other in the same way. They're communicating, they're supporting each other. When do you believe that shift started, and what would you say triggered it? What forced that to happen?
I would say for me, I noticed it definitely during COVID. During the second year of COVID, really, I think the first year was focusing on just surviving, getting all the new legal boundaries and everything in place, but definitely more within the second year. I think it's well documented that social care is vastly underfunded. Our
Right.
financial margins are getting thinner and thinner, national minimum wage is going up. We got to think of overheads, costs of running services, mileage allowance, annual leave, the new employment law where you get paid from day
Absolutely.
one if sick has a massive impact. So putting all this on top of an
Yes.
organisation that's already deeply underfunded, we have to start thinking outside the box. We have to start thinking of what can we do to make things easier and less of a financial impact. And I think particularly during the second year, there was a lot of smaller local care companies who did really struggle. They didn't have the economies of scale, such as my organisation. And what we
Mm-hmm.
often found was these little niche companies had very small, I would say, selling points, USPs.
Right.
So they would have one company who was domiciliary care only, older 65 plus, but they wouldn't manage anybody with a learning disability. So they've got very niche markets. Our organisation is very vast. So we support with mental health, learning disability, autism, physical disability, challenging behaviour,
Right.
addiction. We're quite unique in the fact that we've got quite a wide variety. So
Mm-hmm.
what we found was service users were waiting a long time for a service to start because of everyone just trying to get their heads back on straight. So
Mm-hmm.
commissioners contacted us and said, in this particular area, we have so many people waiting for a service. And we went, why are they waiting? We're still here. Why are they having to wait so long? So what we found was the companies we were once in competition with, we were going, just picking up the phone. Did you know there's 5 people in this area who's been waiting 4 weeks for a care package? If you start them
Right.
all at the same time, they're all in the same area, it reduces your mileage costs. If you take them on, we can take the 3 challenging packages on, and we're
Mm-hmm.
therefore sharing it out and depleting the waiting list in local authorities. And I think having these conversations were very unusual because normally there's no packages there. Everyone's bidding, everyone's wanting that economies of scale. And I think people were
Right.
fearful. Companies were very fearful of what happens if we can't financially make it out of COVID. So in our geographical location, there was definitely a lot more communication. I'd known quite a lot of care managers, CQC registered managers like myself, running residential homes that I'd passed in my 20 years of care. And it
Right.
was reaching out to all my networks and going, what beds have you got available? Did you know
Right.
this? Did you know that? And just having them conversations and being very open. And definitely was the first time in my career where that openness was very welcomed and still to this
Excellent.
day is very welcomed.
What you're sharing there, you've got a couple of organisations that perhaps 5 years ago would have been rivals or competitors. I'm never a massive fan of the word competitive because I genuinely, like, we approach things with a real abundance mindset at the HR Doctor, and it's about, like you say, that communication piece. In my view, your rivals are the ones who keep you sharp. They're the ones who want you to ultimately strive for your best so you can provide the best service possible to your customers. And if you're not keeping an eye on what your rivals are doing, I don't think you're going to be around in the market for a very long time. It seems that cooperation is really quite important, and you don't necessarily have to have, you can still cooperate with a rival. You can still, like you say, find opportunities where you can grow together. And that's a fantastic example really of seeing that communication taking place. And I'd encourage any listener, if they're in a spot at the moment where perhaps they might need a second opinion from somebody who's approaching a challenge in a slightly different way, connect with them. There's no harm in doing that. I think if you've got some kind of way in, like you mentioned there, you've had experience in those other care provisions, then ultimately it's a great way to improve the service that you're ultimately delivering to the end user. In your case, a service user, care, somebody receiving care, or a customer. It's very similar. Ultimately, it's about providing value. How do you provide that value? Communicate with other people that do what you do and see if you can either make it better together or use it as a tool to establish, are we doing things, could we be doing things in a better way? So it seems that, especially in care at the moment, gold service and bronze funding springs to mind straight away. Where do you find that with leaders at the moment, what do they find helps in that equation without perhaps care suffering or people burning out? It's a massive challenge, I find, for a lot of, even within businesses that are private businesses. There's so many additional costs that employers are taking on. You mentioned one a moment ago about the changes in sick pay regulations. That only occurred in April this month, April 2026. We're doing this podcast. And it's one of those things that, again, it really sticks in the claw of a lot of people that run businesses or run enterprises, that it seems that the government are putting the onus on employers to pick up the bill for what would be something that historically they would have had some form of state support for. How do you find people are navigating this now within care sector?
Over the last couple of years, you've got to think about what is going to make the most effective impact with the least financial impact. We've had to put policies and procedures in place and things that employees are not always happy with. They are ratified with legalities and things like that. So we're doing what we need to be doing legally, but it doesn't mean we're happy with the decisions. It's something
Right.
we've had to do to ensure that we've got financial sustainability, to keep them in a job role, to keep them working full time, and to provide the service that they do. I think you don't get into care for the money. Let's be honest. It's the least appealing career. I think it was
Right.
voted one of the least appealing careers in 2023. That was post-COVID, though. I think we recruit based on values, and we don't necessarily take people who have got direct care experience, which a lot of
Right.
care companies do. They will only recruit people with experience. We recruit
Right.
based on values and transferable skills because I can teach you how to administer medication safely. We can give you all the training and competence to do that. We can teach you how to hoist someone, do it safely and with dignity. But what we
Right.
can't teach someone is their values. We can't teach them the type of personality that they've got or their approach to people. That, I think that's something that's innate or comes over
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
period of
Absolutely.
time. And how I dealt with somebody at the age of 20 compared to where I am now, very different. And that's through learning. I would say 60% of our workforce at the moment is over 30. And I would say
Right.
25 to 30% is actually over 40, which is, if you look at standards, the sector averages, that's very different in our organisation. And we do spend a lot of money on training and competencies. But like you mentioned earlier about the turnover of staff, we have a very low sector turnover of staff in our organisation because we will input and upskill, and we will
Right.
look at particular areas of interest. So if somebody's particularly interested in, I really want to understand recruitment, come and sit with our recruitment team. We've got to be careful, obviously GDPR and stuff like that, but we can go through our processes and the things that we do and how we ratify and do the DBS and everything like that. So actually, that's a bit of training that they will get paid
Yeah.
for,
Sure.
but actually they will put that forward because they'll go, wow, did you know I've learned this? And if you spend that time and perhaps a little bit of money, they feel valued. They feel that they are progressing. And I think that's something in our organization we're really good at.
Yeah, absolutely. And genuinely, growth opportunities are a huge engagement tool for any organization to utilize. And one of the things that we're huge on as well at the HR Doctor is around like first principles thinking and really trying to understand, like, simply being able to create a system, a simple system with an organization that helps with these kind of things. And a good onboarding process makes a huge difference for organizations so they can ultimately spot people who perhaps don't share the right values for the organization, because we all know people can interview incredibly well, but then when you see them doing and delivering the service that they've been brought on to do, and that's about, okay, how strong is that measurement process? And simple, I say this word a lot, simplicity is incredibly difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
Anybody can make things more complicated, in my view, by adding a layer of, like you say, complexity. But what we take pride in really through the HR doctor is making sure that we can spot what would be, based on experience, simple things that people can implement that help them achieve the outcomes that they want, which in this case is reduce people burnout, collaboration within a team. You've mentioned previously that you've noticed perhaps some of the camaraderie in teams within care has been reducing. You mentioned, what would you say is being replaced by the camaraderie?
I don't know what the right term would be. There's definitely still that level of camaraderie, definitely
Right,
within teams. But I think now I'm seeing the camaraderie between teams, between services, and between
right.
organizations. The hard lines between this is who we support and that's who you support, and we're not going to tell you anything about our
I'm with you.
business.
Right.
That's definitely changed.
Speaking to that there as well, I see this a great deal in teams where there's perhaps, and I'm all for healthy competition. I think that's a useful tool. But it's also got the challenge with that can sometimes be where you've got two teams competing with each other. It can become about the team rather than the overall goal. And like the way I tend to frame this in teams is that you think about it, be ambitious. Ambitious, in my view, is about wanting to grow and wanting to grow with the mission that you're on. Whereas if you've got people who are incredibly competitive in the team, then that growth sometimes can suffer. So coming back to your point about the growth opportunities within businesses and giving people training, and that's very much about aligning with ambition, which in my view is a very healthy thing to do. It's about how do we grow this person? It's very healthy as well, folks, about the pounds and pence sense. Why do we need an engaged team? Because they stay. And if they stay, then ultimately your customers get a better experience, your service provider, your care users get a better experience. And with that, your business model is a hell of a lot stronger. And ultimately, people, business leaders, have to accept that in order to grow their organization, they do need people in order to do that. That's the offset. That's the responsibility with entering into that world of, if we need people to grow, then, well, we've got to look after those people as well. And I'm all for accountability, don't get me wrong, but it's about, like, in my mind, how do we address that as leaders? It's about speaking to the ambition rather than the competition. It's about helping that person grow. And with that, ultimately, you achieve your mission a lot quicker, more effectively. Have you noticed that as well within some teams where perhaps the competition is that high, it can sometimes muddy the mission that they're on? It could become a lot more individualism, a lot more individualistic to that person on the team rather than the wider, this is why we're doing it. Are they losing sight of something? Do you find there, Karen?
I think sometimes it can happen, even within a business like ourselves where camaraderie is really high. I think sometimes
Mm,
you forget that sense of consensus and you forget that we're here for that individual. And my team sometimes will feel we've got our red tape, we've got our legalities, but we want to
right.
advocate for this person. And sometimes you advocate for them and you forget your boundary or you forget the mission of why you're doing it. I think that's something that I've noticed.
So, and one thing I find, certainly for organisations that work in the care sector, you've got a bunch of people who are incredibly motivated by helping others. There's a huge care aspect to that. And as you were sharing earlier about the chap who had a bereavement and which later then surfaced the addiction as well, that was something that ultimately, again, it speaks to the nature of people in care, that I do genuinely find that people who are more open to helping others are also open to perhaps being in a situation where they could potentially experience some form of addiction or some form of mind health challenge. So it's about, okay, what can we do as employers? What can we do as leaders to support that as well? And again, there's a real financial benefit for business leaders to understand that too. It's not only about the, what some people would say, the woolly, people focused approach of HR. It's about now, it makes sense to do it that way. There's much more longevity in doing it that way than there would to the alternative. So just on that then, so from a mind health perspective, it seems that certainly the care demographic we've mentioned there perhaps are the centerpiece really, and as far as how they approach the work. What would you say most employers picture someone, how do they hear addiction, how does it present? If you said addiction to some people, they might think, oh, it's somebody who's unemployed or somebody who's homeless, or that's immediate. They're the kind of, yeah, I'm not saying that's right by any means. You could easily picture somebody that perhaps has an addiction that fits that kind of that image. Who are the people that are really delivering this work that are subject to or open to falling into addiction?
I think what you're saying is right. I think there's a preconceived judgment on an
Mm,
individual that you can spot a mile off. I say these people, please, in a generic term, don't work, are homeless, take
mm,
drugs out of choice, look a certain type of way, will engage in criminal activity. So there's all these prejudgments that we've made and these stigmas that we've attached to addiction. Now, if I look at the individuals that, not one that we support, but also in the background and services that I'm aware of, actually, the majority of them are middle class working people who are
right.
working, are married, have families. And I would say 60 to 70% of them are having difficulties with addiction because of a trauma that's happened in their life. Now,
Hmm.
that's not going to be across the whole of the UK. That's just in the areas that I'm aware, and that's just my consensus of the information that I've got. But I think there is a misunderstanding of addiction. And I think with addiction, people often think it stops at the proverbial door and it doesn't come into work. Eventually it does. Eventually it does. I often see addiction as a continuum rather than you're not an addict, then you are an addict. There's no hard line.
Right.
It's a continuum of early use starting to impact life, now impacting all areas of your life. So it's like a continuum, and people can move up and down that continuum during their life. And I think that's how I try to explain it as clearly as I can, that somebody can stay in the user part of the continuum for 20 years, have some drugs on a weekend when I'm drinking with my friends, and they can stay on that part of the continuum for the rest of their life. But say that
Yes.
individual has a traumatic event in their life, they shift up
Mm,
that continuum and actually they're using it to cope, just to cope with day to day. And I think when we understand addiction as a chronic disorder, our perception
mm.
changes. I think the stigma that's attached to it is definitely something that impacts how people perceive it.
Yeah, and I do genuinely find that there is that stigma amongst people. The things are not as they're not always as they seem when you look at different people and their experiences are certainly perhaps shaping where they go to as far as if their relationship to alcohol, for example. It's not uncommon for a lot of business leaders to use alcohol as a medication, as a way in which to calm down of an evening having gone through a stressful day. It's so I do genuinely think there's a lot of people in the audience perhaps that can share that understanding of how it can potentially show up in the workplace. I suppose, like using that example, we're not just talking about people, we could be speaking about somebody that's a full-time professional with an active addiction. What kind of things are they doing on 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning that looks indistinguishable from anybody else that you've noticed that could actually, it could take them down a path of needing some kind of intervention or a leadership conversation? What kind of early signs would you say from a line manager's perspective that would currently perhaps be dismissed, might not be something, but actually it is?
Yeah, I think the first thing for me is, if you know your team, finding something that's out of the ordinary, something that
Mm,
changes. And we all have good days and bad days. And I'm not saying any of these indicators on their own will tell you somebody has got an addiction difficulty. It's looking at these indicators comparative to the person over a period of time. We all have nights
mm,
where we don't sleep and we come to work the next day, hair unwashed. For me, bun in my hair, unwashed. And you think, okay, today's just one of those days. What I'm saying is it's consecutive things that we're looking for that are out of the norm.
right.
Definitely looking unkept in appearance with somebody who usually looks really kept, somebody who often has their nails done and then suddenly they're not having their nails done. And these are little indicators. Okay. And then
Yes,
looking
yeah.
at how they show up at work. Are they as busy as they usually are? Are they making excuses to leave meetings? Are they changing their routines? One thing I always look at, and I always tell professionals, that we make a societal norm out of alcohol and food. Big law firm gets a big win. They automatically go out and have, I say they, not always, there's an assumption they go out and have a few drinks. So we're making a
Right.
societal norm out of this. So what we're all very careful of is actually if we're doing a team success thing or celebrating something, we don't have anything like that involved in it. We'll choose an activity to do instead. So we've got to
Mm,
be careful of them societal norms. Now, for me, I would look out for things that change in the individual. So looking at these work success things, we're going out on Friday night. Everyone okay if I book the bowling alley for 7 o'clock? Everyone can eat before they come, or if you
right.
want to eat, you can come afterwards, whatever you want to do. If
Yeah.
somebody's then saying, oh, I can only do it between the hours of 6 and 8, very short window, you go, okay. Sometimes I've got to be back before I put the kids to bed and things like that. But it's narrowing down options. And that's usually because that habit has taken a form and it's affecting their decisions. And they know there's a short window of opportunity where they won't need to use the substance and nobody will notice before the
Right.
physical symptoms show. So they may be sweating, get the shakes, foggy mind. Now, again,
Right.
this is not just having these signs means that you have got an addiction. It's looking at a series of things over time.
I'm with you. I'm with you. It's interesting. From what you've shared, there's a correlation really between like mind health moving forward in workplaces. And it seems that some of the addiction pieces, it stayed in the grey a bit. It doesn't seem, and in
Yeah.
my view, they're probably quite closely related as far as what's triggering somebody to want to use a substance. And again, that could be alcohol, it could be food. There's lots of different ways in which addiction can show up. But it walk me through from your experience, like how you would typically approach that with somebody like in a delicate way. 'Cause I'd find that there's probably people listening now that are thinking, what, such and such, I can see that perhaps popping up in my team. What would be like a really, again, it's a tricky conversation. I find that a lot of this, it's the psychology going on in somebody's mind about the unknown response. What's your experience of approaching this with team members? Do you have a certain way of approaching it, or have you found that uncertainty can be quite quickly when they respond? And is it a positive response, or what's your experience of that?
It's definitely very emotional. It's a very emotive conversation, and not very
Right.
often do people disclose on the first meeting. And that's what I'll say. Don't see that as a level of success or failure. You're opening the door, and at some point that person will come back. You've got to leave that door open. But
Hmm.
it's about having open, curious, early conversations. So if you know your team well enough, I feel I could pull one of my team to one side and go, I'm a little bit worried. We care and we want to make sure you're okay, but we've noticed one, two, three. Is everything okay? How can I help you?
Right.
And quite often people are off guard. They don't expect these things to be noticed or to be discussed. So normally on the first meeting, people will say, no, everything's fine, just stuff going on at home. And second meeting, look, I'm still a little bit worried. You can tell me to mind my own business. But we've now
Right.
noticed 4 and 5, and 1, 2, and 3 is still happening. So we just want to make sure you're well. Do you need to take some annual leave? Do you need to give options? And quite often, even on the second meeting, they won't want to tell you, but you've opened that door again for them to feel safe. These are your
Right.
options. Look, we've got some lines if you want to ring them. You can ring ACAS if you want to, if you want some independent advice, if there's something going on at work. Here's the policies and procedures. So you're giving them all the information that you can and your time and that open door. And quite
Absolutely.
often, what will happen is they will come to you. They will come to you and say, look, I know you've noticed 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Well, 6 has happened, and now I can't cope. I need help.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I
normally at
mean,
1 and 2, people won't ask for help. It's when it starts spiraling.
and again, that early intervention is so useful, isn't it, to be able to stop the spiral and becoming a bigger challenge. It's looking after those early signs before they become challenging and much bigger later down the line. It comes back to what we were saying about the sort of 90% good people ops is about 90% prevention and 10% response. And if we can get the prevention right, then a lot of these challenges can be dealt with quickly. And what I'm hearing there as well, as you were sharing it, it's around the openness, approaching it with an open mind. And I find that organizations that get this right, they can be quite experimentative. They can look at the whole process as well. I find if you're working for an innovative company, they tend to be a lot more open-minded to this type of work. Whereas if you work with an organization that's constantly trying to reduce mistakes within the business, then that can be quite counterintuitive for building what would be quite innovative approaches to the way in which you service. So it's making people aware that, look, they can share these things without feeling concerned that they're going to be managed out of the business, or it's a way for them to. And again, what I encourage leaders to do is to really encourage the teams to bring forward and surface these challenges early, like we said earlier, because ultimately, if the team member is only focused on not making mistakes, then when there is a mistake that comes, they're not going to be very quick to share what that mistake is. And most leaders I speak to know what's going on within the business. So it's about understanding, okay, if that's what you find is a useful way in which to lead, to know what's going on within the business, then encourage people to come to you with mistakes rather than keeping them back. And because ultimately they become a hell of a lot bigger later down the line, as we've established, very quickly surfacing them and resolving them. So again, that's the leadership piece, and how we would typically approach leadership through the HR doctor. It's exactly that. It's about upskilling leaders so they understand that you can encourage people to approach the challenges that they're facing with the leader as a collaboration. It's a way in which, okay, let's get to the heart of the truth of what's creating that challenge, and then we'll figure a way of working a way through it and problem solving it, but you're doing it together. And that's a fantastic way in which to approach it. What would you say is the single most damaging thing a well-meaning manager could do when they first suspect somebody's perhaps got addiction?
I think it's the approach that you take. The worst thing you can go in is go into a room and say, I think you've got an alcohol problem. That's putting someone on the back foot straight away. That is your assumption. You don't know it's true. I think you need to approach it with an open mind. You need to show the identifiers and allow them the space, because what we don't want to do is actually assume somebody's got something and they haven't. They might have a really negative GP appointment the night before and had a really bad medical diagnosis that they just haven't shared with you yet because they haven't got it straight in their mind. You can't go in accusing people of having something that they haven't got. And I think that was one of the biggest things that I'd say. Don't go in with the assumption that you are right and what you suspect is right. It's about having them open conversations and giving people the floor space, because a lot of people will not actually identify they've got a problem. You will see things before they do.
It's interesting. But again, it comes back to that. If we're communicating regularly with the team, that there is that culture that people can surface challenges quickly, they're going to be a hell of a lot more open with the leader. And ultimately, we say that leaders go first. That's the definition of a leader, in my view. And ultimately, with that, it's the leader that has to approach this in, like you say, in a diplomatic way with a certain element of tact. There's ways of doing that, certainly. And it sounds that, some of that information you've shared there certainly gives people a bit of work to focus on for the next one-to-one that they're doing. Or what would you say, just out of curiosity then, so you said open early with curious conversations. What would be like an opening line that a leader could use that tomorrow with somebody that they are a bit worried about?
I think, honestly, we don't recognize how empowering the sentence is. Are you okay?
Right.
We use that so many times a day, but without intention. And I think it is actually put the pen and paper down. Don't have the screen in front of you. I'm going to lean in and I'm actually going to say, are you okay? It's an open-ended, and it's how you have that conversation. It's how you deliver the words that's really important. I think quite often when you're in a one-to-one, I've got to document it. We've got to have it signed. We've got to put it on the system, and it's very time sensitive. Actually put everything aside, one-to-one, safe room. Are you okay?
Yeah. And what would you say, because again, I can hear some of the audience members, perhaps who are leaders themselves, thinking, what happens if the employee says there's nothing wrong? And initially, my view on this would be, and I might be wrong, but again, the only way things get stronger is if you repeat them. And while something might not work the first time or the second time, it might start working the third time. And by the time you've got to the fourth opportunity, the other people that are observing what's going on, again, it strengthens that team as well, because they understand that's the way we do things here. So that repetition is quite an important piece. But how do you approach that if somebody says nothing's wrong? Like, how would you address that with that person?
I think if there was things that I'd seen or I was concerned about, it wouldn't be a formal meeting anyway. It would be, as I mentioned earlier, I've noticed 1 and 2. Are you okay? Is everything going on okay? Is there anything I can help you with? How can I help? And it's very easy quick fire questions, because I think the more information you try to give, it can make it look like you're suspecting them of something. So I think it's being very mindful of your language and very mindful
Yeah,
of your
sure.
delivery. No, I won't sit there and go, number one, I've noticed this and this. I will go in and go, okay, I've noticed you've been late twice this week. You're never late. Are you okay? Is everything okay? And I think that's the important part.
I'm with you. And again, there's another piece to this. This is the slightly more, I'd say, dry part of people ops, where you've got to consider policies and procedures. And whilst it is a dry part of the work that we do, it's incredibly important because it's ultimately the policies and the procedures that set the standard and the framework as to how things are done within organisations. It's a big part of governance too. With anything legal, it's not what we know, it's what we can prove that follows up on
Yeah.
things. So what would you
Yeah.
say from a policies and procedures perspective that some organisations have wrong in theirs right now that you've noticed in this particular area?
I think I mentioned earlier, a lot of people assume that addiction stops at that proverbial door, and a lot of
Mm,
organizations will have, in care, for example, an addiction policy for service users. Actually, you need to have a policy for staff as well. And I think, like I said, that assumption it stops at the door, and it doesn't. I do think there needs to be some upskilling and training for the management team to deal with not
hmm
just discussions about addiction, but conversations on sensitive topics in general. You mentioned earlier about sometimes people will avoid them because they're not nice to have. And
Right.
sometimes they are very emotive, and you are using all of your skills as a leader, as a manager, to manage that situation. So there's definitely some upskilling, language, and I think if you suspect addiction in your workplace, I think make sure you've got your legal stuff behind you. What have we got in place that can help this individual? What's in a local community that we can refer this person to and go to that meeting informed? So when
Other
somebody says,
helplines, that kind of thing.
yeah, if, somebody does say, I have an addiction, I'm struggling, you're not then going, I don't know what to do. You're going
Right.
in informed and going, okay, what I've identified is we have this phone number. It's nothing to do with the business. It's completely impartial. You can call that at any time if you need advice. Don't forget, I'm here if you need me as well. And it's just going
Mm.
in, upskilling, language, your approach, and going in ready for them conversations.
I'm with, and it's like you say, those conversations, even though they are modest conversations to begin with, has a huge impact on the reducing some of the stigma involved in speaking about these type of things. And I genuinely think that with anything, if you shed enough light on something, then you find a way and what would be an elegant, optimal way in which to resolve whatever that problem is. And I understand the hesitancy, like we touched on earlier about the hesitancy around business leaders, about how much do we connect with this? How much responsibility do I have? Yeah, it's got to be balanced. I understand. Yeah, I think that's an important piece. But because they are spending so much time working, I genuinely think there's a responsibility there to, like you say, not necessarily resolve that challenge for them, but point them in the direction. And there's different layers to this, isn't there, really, Karen? We're focused here on how do we initially approach this from a pragmatic perspective, from what's the conversation we're having with the team member at 8 o'clock on Monday, having somebody listen to this conversation today, our podcast. And for a leader who is listening and realizing perhaps that they might have missed signs within their own team, what would you say the first thing they need to do this week would be?
Touch base with that person. I think the most important thing is early, curious conversation. And I think that would always be my first advice for everyone is have a conversation, have an informal conversation. This will not be shared outside these doors unless there is a safeguarding or I'm really concerned about your mental health. Let's have an honest conversation. How are you? Is everything okay? How can we help? We've noticed these things. I think quite often people will jump towards the legalities or a formal meeting, or we forget the
Mm,
importance of them informal conversations and how powerful they can be, and also the impact that they have on the next set of staff when that issue is resolved and they've had all the support that they can have and the positives
mhm.
that can come out of that for your team as a culture. They may not share with the team what's happened, but they can say, I was really supported by management. I went through this really difficult period. And that word of mouth and that relationship that you form is worth more than money. That culture that you create and the empowerment that you have in your team is worth more than the gold that you can receive.
Absolutely. Again, what speaks to me here, we speak a lot in people ops circles around like how to approach a complaint or a grievance or even reasonable adjustments. This pops up all the time. And I'm a huge advocate for dealing with things informally to begin with, because most challenges that are created within an organization, a lot of the time it's establishing like how soon is the intervention taking place. And if the intervention's a very quick, informal conversation with somebody on a private basis that doesn't necessarily get minuted, it's just purely coming from a place of we want to help you. Again, it's coming from that ambition of we want to grow. We want you to grow as somebody that's within this team. And how can we help? That's a very healthy way in which to approach it. It's not really combative. I find sometimes there's a challenge here around expectation about what people expect in return from either raising a challenge to begin with. And in my view, again, it comes back to that education piece that we're discussing now. How do we manage team members' expectations so they understand that what would be a reasonable response to these kind of things? And I genuinely think that an informal approach to begin with can be very powerful, much more powerful than even submitting a formal request for whether it's like a reasonable adjustment in the workplace. If you're the kind of employer that's building that culture where people can approach and ask the question, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to get what they're asking for. Again, it's about managing expectations and understanding what the legality is behind it if we're approaching it from a HR perspective, but from a resource perspective as well. And again, care's subject to huge constraints on resources around if people are asking for a change in hours or a certain approach. But it seems to me the power really is initially, let's get it out in the open, shed some light on it, and find a way forward, albeit informally to begin with. And that might be a really great segue to the next phase of building what would be a more formal strategy around it behind a business. It's going after those edges first, which I find is really powerful. And it seems like the edges at the moment it's the informal conversation. It's showing that the team that ultimately you care about their well-being.
The element first.
Yeah, exactly. Look, the businesses are made up of humans, regardless of what Elon Musk wants to do with his robotics and whatever else he's trying to do. But ultimately, and that's going to be the case for the next 20, 30 years, at least, it's very much a matter of, having those conversations, being curious, being open-minded. That's what I've been listening as you've been going through. That seems to be a really big part of the strategy for a business when we're approaching these kind of activities and these kind of conversations. What do you think then? So quick, I appreciate we're coming to the end of the podcast now, Karen, but what, in one sentence, what do you want the listener to do differently by Friday next week?
Early, curious conversations. I know I keep saying that, but like we said, the power of them. Think of them as a human first. That humanity element is so important, not just for the situation at hand, but also moving forward and knowing that you are there to support them, not just as a leader or as a manager, but as a fellow human. And I think by next Friday, if you have got any concerns with anyone in your business, have that early curious conversation, do that mental health check-in, check that they're okay.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, it's been a real pleasure to catch up with you today, Karen. And if anybody wants to get in touch with Karen, we'll have her details below in the description. You can connect with her on social media as well. We'll have that below in the description.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.